In this video, let us continue working on the midground mountains. Now, I'm going to keep things pretty rough at this point because I just want them living in the same world first before I go too ahead into the details. So, selecting the curves layer which we used to indicate shadow in the last lesson, let's use a soft round brush and start painting into it. Now, one difference you guys might notice from the last video to this is that the front foreground section, which we do not need, is back. And that is because Photoshop crashed between the two videos. So heading back up, and if I turn my globals off, you can see that there is a huge color difference between the midground and the background mountains. Now to fix that, let's first start by adding a hue saturation layer on top of our mountain. Going over to the cyans, I'm going to push the hue up into the blues. Then going back into the master and pushing that up slightly. Going to our layer where we have our rocks mask, let me choose a soft round brush and start sampling colors right from the sky. Choosing from different sections of the sky, let's start to slowly paint that in. Now since we have this on its own layer, we can always turn the opacity down or up. In this case, slightly down is working for us. Now if I enable the shadows layer, you can see that it's darkening things quite a bit. So I'm going to add a color balance layer on the top of our current stack for the midground mountains. And let's play around with the midtones in the cyans and in the blues. Going over into the highlights. It's looking quite blue, but it's now starting to live in the same world as the foreground. Let me turn back my black and white and take a look at how my values are looking. And since the values are working, it's good news for us. So let's proceed ahead. Selecting the layer again and duplicating that, moving it on to the top, turning my black and white global on, adding a curves. We don't need the foreground for now, so let me turn that off. So let's start adding in some contrast, similar to what we did in the last video with the highlight layer for the background mountains. Apply the layer mask. We are quite happy with it. And on a full black mask, that's I just filled it up with black, I'm just going to reveal where the light is hitting to add more emphasis to it. Again, using a soft round brush here. Adding it over to the tops of these mountains and a little bit to the side, and adding some bounce light from it because snow ends up reflecting a lot. So there would be a lot of bounce light. Now that layer also needs to be adjusted for color value. So adding a hue saturation on top and moving it underneath the curves. Let's push our cyans. Go back to the master. Let's try playing with it. And I'm adding another hue saturation layer after the curves and just pulling the saturation down. So let me quickly pause the video while I go ahead and save it, and let's resume then. Alright, we are back. So going over to the background folder, let me expand that and turn off my foreground. So on the shadow side, let me add a curves to the top of the stack. Move that to the side and turn off my midground. Now we need to add a little bit more darker value to it. Fill that up with black and slowly start to reveal it onto the right hand side. Now you can see that adding this layer and painting into the mask, it is blending it much better with the sky behind. Pushing the values further down. And going back into the midgrounds, let me just dock my adjustment palette. Now these two adjustment layers which we had turned off before, let's just remove them. And let me just turn on and off my shadow layer. Now it feels that one needs to be adjusted better. So filling that up with white and now using a soft round brush with black color, I'm just going to paint in sections where I want light to hit. So I'm doing opposite of what we were doing before with the same layer. Another layer on top which we didn't need, so I'll just remove that off. Adding a hue saturation layer and going over to the cyans, pushing my hues up. Going up to the master, slightly adjusting there. Back to our cyan. Into our shadow layer. Let's start adding some slight reflected light in. Going over and adding a curves adjustment layer on top of this current stack. And going into the blues. And just pushing up the highlights. That is from say around the 0.5 to the 1 mark. Just increasing that in the blue channel. And using and painting into the mask again with a soft round brush. Going back into the shadow layer, just tweaking it. As you can see that our midground mountain is now fitting in quite well with the background. Heading up to the lighter section, going into the cyans, up back into the curves. Let me add some reds in there. Onto the blues. Add some yellows in. Again, fine tweaking our red. Back to our hue saturation layer and making some adjustments into the yellows and the reds. Slightly moving the hues and adjusting the saturations. And painting ever so slightly into the layer mask. So you can see I'm adding a lot of bounce light onto the snow. And I'm very gentle with the pen pressure here. So in the next video, let's take a look at adding the front barrier section.